Hello, folks. Welcome again. What a gorgeous day outside it is. Let me know if there's any problems with the sound or anything coming through. As always, let me know and I'll try to fix it. I did have my window open here all day as I'm working here in my home office, and I had to close it for this because the Aurora Adult Day Services, my friends over there nearby, are outside singing today, and it's wonderful to listen to, but I'm afraid it would interrupt our audio here. So I had to close the windows, so they will be opened right again as soon as we're done here because it's too perfect of a day outside. Let's get started. Again, thanks for listening. A lot of folks I know aren't watching live. That's okay. Got a lot of feedback, thank you, after last week's live stream from folks who watched it later. So I did get a lot of questions. Got several ideas for possible topics in the future, so we'll talk about those as well. But please, if you have any comments, either live as you're watching today or later, pop them in the comments and I'd be glad to chat a little more about them. Again, I sit here all day with my own ideas thinking about what people might be thinking about history-wise, and it's great to hear the comments from everyone else as to what you're thinking and some questions that are on your mind. One person today actually suggested the Working Girls Home, which used to be in East Aurora, and that's one that I forgot about last time that's asked about a lot. And working girls might have a different connotation today, but it wasn't the term working girls was for young women who in our community stayed in this home, and there was actually an organization in the community that started out small and larger and grew to help a lot of young women who some had developmental disabilities to find work in the community. And so we'll talk about that another day. So that's a great idea. And thanks for that suggestion. Today I thought we could talk about, I have gotten a lot of feedback about names and how ever since I wrote a column, I think it was last month or the month before, about my monthly column for the East Aurora Advertiser, about how East Aurora got its name and who put the East in East Aurora. Because it doesn't make any sense if you think about it. There's an original Aurora on Cayuga Lake, and the reason I'm thinking about it again is we went on vacation about 2 weeks ago, and we actually stopped in that other Aurora. It's the village of Aurora in Cayuga County, right on Cayuga Lake, and we're actually east of that Aurora. So it's very strange to think about that, like, you know, well, people get confused. We're the town of Aurora, they're the village of Aurora, and for years we've been getting the right people coming to the wrong town or the wrong community. And so I investigated a little bit about, you know, why do we have this weird anomaly happening? Well, I'll post a link to my column that I wrote a few months ago, about who put the East in East Aurora. But long story short, this happened a lot. A lot of communities ended up having the same name. And it got confusing because it was a very informal process. You didn't really have to register anywhere as to where you were, what you were calling your community. But what really clinched it was the post office. The post office comes along, and if you applied to have a post office, you could not have the same name of another community in the same state. So a really easy example is West Falls, the hamlet of West Falls here in the town of Aurora. They applied to get a post office in the mid-1800s, and they had actually had the name Florence, and they liked that name. The settlers had come, and from in honor of where they came from, they named their community Florence after Florence in Europe. And the post office said, no, you can't have that name. We already have a Florence, New York. So they had to come up with a new name for their post office, which was West Falls, which makes sense because there are waterfalls up on the hill, actually in the town of Colden, if you go outside of the hamlet of West Falls. And they named their community because there were falls on the western end of the town, West Falls. And so they were allowed to have that name. And Florence went by the wayside, and West Falls became the name of the community. And actually, Crockershire was the name of it before Florence. And so if you see any documentation, you'll notice that there's uh, people sometimes will see Crockershire and like, where was that? It was West Falls. But it really depended on who lived there at the time. Griffin's Mills was originally known as Smith's Mills because of Mr. Smith owned most of the property there, and he owned the mill. And Mr. Griffin came along, the Griffin family, and then they named it Griffin's Mills. And it was very informal. And only when the post office actually came along and needed a technical name for places did the name start to become official. And this is really what happened with Aurora and East Aurora. So in 1818, we had a new town formed out of the town of Willink. We're going to talk about that name in a bit, Willink. A lot of towns name themselves Aurora. There's a lot of them around. Actually, we did a Google search a couple days ago just to figure out how many there were. There's a lot. Aurora means, a lot of people think about the Aurora Borealis, but actually the Aurora in this case, or probably in any town's case, community's case of naming their community, comes from another definition, the goddess of the dawn. So daybreak. And the idea was that it was the dawn of a new town, new community, and there was optimism. Aurora, that name is optimistic. And so there was a lot of optimism for the new town. So we believe either folks who were here adopted that name because they had come from the Finger Lakes region and liked it, or they just decided that's a name they liked. And Aurora, Holland, and Wales were formed from the old town of Willink. So you have the town of Aurora. Well, then there was the, up by where Vidler's is today, and the movie theater, that end of town had become known as Aurora. And actually for a short period of time, it was an actually incorporated village of Auroraville. And then the other end of town was named Willink because the post office had set up, we were the town of Willink. The whole area here was in the town of Willink. And when they set up a post office, they named it Willink. Well, that post office eventually ended up down by where the circle is today. Well, then people were kind of upset up on the other end of town because they had a post office that was a full mile away. Well, today that's no big deal. I drive a mile to get to our post office at the West End. But back then, the people up at, we'll call it the Vidler's End, the hamlet of Aurora End, they were upset they had to go a full mile to get to their post office. So they petitioned the post office to come up with a second postal district, a second post office. And they agreed, finally in 1850, to create a second post office in the area of where Olean Road comes in, the village in that little hamlet of Aurora. Well, here comes the problem. It would have been easy to keep the one at the West End named Willink and the one at the East End name it Aurora, because there was a little hamlet, unofficial community, so there wasn't a government of its own post office to name that one Aurora. So you'd have Willink at one end, they had had that name for a while, and Aurora at the other. Well, the problem was the post office, just like it did with West Falls, said, you can't have that name. You need to pick a new name. And so, because there was already the Aurora in Cayuga County. So they came up with this neat little system, which actually made sense, is the one at the west end of town, down by what is today the Circle, was going to be named West Aurora, the West Aurora Post Office. And the one at the eastern end of town, where Vidler's is today, and the movie theater, that would be East Aurora. Wonderful. The only problem is the folks at the West End kept getting used to, they were used to the name Willink. So it got really confusing, and especially after, in New York State, we have this interesting system where within towns you can incorporate a village. We'll talk about that another time because that's a very fascinating subject of why we have villages and what purpose they serve, dating back to the 1800s. But they incorporated a village at the West End called Willink. But they had a West Aurora post office. So you would, when people asked you where you lived, you'd be like, well, I live in Willink, but send my mail to West Aurora. So that name West Aurora didn't last very long, only a couple years. So they ended up reverting back to the Willink name. And then East Aurora at the other end of town couldn't change to Aurora. They had to stick with East Aurora, and they just stayed with it. So then you had an East Aurora without the West Aurora. And then in 1874, they decided to expand the boundaries of the village of Willink, and they voted. And this shows how much it's important to vote. By 19 votes, they picked between Willink and East Aurora, and East Aurora won by 19 votes. So we could have been in the village of Willink, but we are now in the village of East Aurora without a West Aurora. So that's how our village and then the post office kept the name East Aurora. That's why East Aurora is west of the original Aurora, which is in Cayuga County. So this happens a lot. These very strange ways we get our names of our communities and our streets. Going back to Willink, that vote over between Willink and East Aurora fascinates me because Willink is named after, so there's several iterations of the name Willink. It was a town, and then it was a village, and then it became a post office, and all those things have been dissolved. But they held on, the residents of these communities held on to that name for so long, which fascinates me because it was named after Wilhelm Willink, who was an agent of the Holland Land Company, which had gained support or gained control of all the land in western New York. And towns back then actually were just basically survey. They just had survey purposes. So they would just take transits from north to south, and you would be in that town. So we landed where East Aurora is today. Landed in the town of Willink, which extended all the way from Lake Ontario to the Pennsylvania border. And then as governments formed within these new towns and more residents came, they made the towns smaller. And we in present-day Aurora kept keeping the name Willink. But the funny thing is a lot of folks were holding on to that name, but he was essentially it wasn't essentially, he was a controversial landlord, and he never set foot, as far as we can tell, in East Aurora, Western New York. So we were naming our town after, and our village and our post office after a man who had never set foot in our community. That I found that interesting, and so that the vote, but people just liked that name and held on to that name, and I don't think they really cared about the history of that name. But it is really important to look back at the history of how we name things. Like why is it important to do that? Well, I think if you look at the names of things, it shows where the priorities are for the community. A lot of times people will ask about how a road was named, and we think that the road was named if it's named after a family or it has a surname. For instance, Payne Street or Boyce Road or any number of these roads in the community. Main Street's easy, it's the Main Street. But they think that it was named in honor of the family, when in fact, any road that was around in the 1800s, it really was less of an honorary, a thing to honor the families. It was more of a directional. So, and I just learned this, like even the streets that are named after trees, Elm Street doesn't have an elm tree on it. It doesn't have elm trees, and everyone thought, well, perhaps it was because there were all sorts of trees lining Elm Street. Well, in fact, no, it was named after one elm tree, a giant elm tree that stood at the corner of Main and Elm Street. That elm tree actually came down a fire in a nearby building, and it was in the 1910s. It was dangerous, so they ended up taking it down. But that was after they had put street signs up. Because before street signs, there were no formal names for roads. It would just develop over time as people would call a certain road. So like if you were giving someone a direction, you would point down the street and say, turn at, and you would always put the in front of the street. So if you read any old diaries or newspaper articles, they'll say the Elm Street. And you'd point down there, and they would see the giant elm tree and turn at the street that had the street next to the elm tree. So it would be the Elm Street. Church Street doesn't have a church on it anymore, but it did have a very large church, a relatively large church compared to the other buildings that were surrounding it, right at the corner of Main Street. So you go down and say, turn at the Church Street. There wasn't a street sign necessarily, but someone would see the church and turn where the church was. Same with family names, family streets. Roads weren't necessarily formalized, so you would say, "Oh, go to the Boyce Road." That's how you would go down Boyce Road to get to the Boyce family farm, or Underhill Road. Go down Underhill Road to get to the Underhill farm. Seneca Street, Buffalo Road, Olean Road. You'd say the Olean Road to get to Olean. It was more of a directional than an official name of the roads. The 20th century comes along, vehicles, there's this highway system put in place, and they start officially naming roads. And so that's when you start getting formal names for roads that you had really never had before. And so now we have roads that have been named that way for a very long time. But there are some roads in our community that, and in many communities, not just East Aurora, that were changed names often, depending on who lived there. So Walnut Street has walnut, it still does have some walnut trees on it, fewer than it did. But that was originally known as Peak Street. Christopher Peak, who owned, he had a lot of money, and he owned a large house that still stands on Walnut Street. And they named it Peak Street. But after he left, that name fell out of use because Mr. Peak, it was no longer a street that got you to Mr. Peak's house. So it got renamed Walnut Street. Payne Street today went back and forth from Chestnut Street. It was named Chestnut Street for years. We have some maps that show it was around the same time called both. And because Mr. Payne owned all the land around Payne Street, that they would name it the Payne Street. So a lot of times the names that we have today are from just directionals, that it was either who owned the land around it, and the road cut through their farm. It wasn't necessarily one person, one lot on that road, or a tree that was there, or a church that was there, and it wasn't necessarily to honor the church or the tree that was there, but it was just a way to get people to where they needed to go. And one exception in East Aurora, and I was really kind of intrigued by this, I'll talk about it from the beginning, is Ernst Place, which is outside of McDonald's. And people forget about that one because it's on the Circle. But before the Circle was put in 1936 as part of a WPA project and a widening of Main Street at the West End, there actually was a road there. It was more like a triangle, and there was a road there. And Lawrence Ernst was the first service member to die in World War I from East Aurora. And so they named that road Ernst Place in his honor. And so that, and by extension, it's in honor of everybody who gave their lives from our community in the service during conflicts. So that road is named in honor of somebody more recently. We can't seem to find when they officially named the road, but it just started appearing. We can't find when the village board voted to name the road, and there's a lot of theories about that name of that road and things, but it was definitely named in honor of him, Lawrence Ernst, so you'll hear his name quite a bit among the folks that gave their lives during World War I. But most roads come from there wasn't a formality to it. There wasn't a formal vote that says we're going to name this road this, or our community this, or this hamlet this. It just happened out of just usage within the community. And you'll see that happen a lot in a lot of communities. And a lot of times I'll notice that people aren't very creative about coming up with names for things. Again, they'll name it for the tree that was there, or even today, some developers in some communities, they do have to go through a process now. Um, Again, the post office, they had a very legitimate reason for wanting different names for different communities throughout the state. Well, today, emergency services, there is a purpose, there is a reason why you can't have a name that sounds too close to another name nearby. If you're calling 911 and you're telling them where you are, they don't want it to be too close. And there is a process to go through naming new roads. But sometimes you'll go around and you'll see that a development, you'll be like, where do they come up with that name? And I know in some communities it was the developer's daughter's name, and they named the road after their daughter or their granddaughter or something like that. So that does happen. But your older roads, you don't have to go far to see why they named that road that name. Um, but a lot of names, so when you're looking at old maps too, it gets a little frustrating because some of the streets have changed actually rather recently. We have a 1909 map that has Weeks Road out in the town and Not Sweet Road, and there's other names for roads based off of who lived there at the time, and it was more fluid than it was today. Today, changing the name of a road is rather difficult because there's so many things connected to your address, and so that they keep it static. You don't get to change a road name as much as you did in the past. One of the things I learned about as I was thinking about this was the role of the post office in all this, and how important it would have been for the post office, even in the 1800s, to make sure that there weren't conflicting names with the same state. But the zip code didn't even come around to the 1960s. So this thing we're so used to, that the zip code that you put when you send a letter, that the zip code kind of directs it to the right place, regardless how close the names are. So the two Auroras, or East Aurora and Aurora, the zip code helps get the mail where it was going. But before the 1960s, there was no zip code. You just put someone's name. And in many communities, there weren't even addresses. You'd put their name and just the town, the post office where it was supposed to go, and it would get there. And that's more when people picked up their mail, too. But just thinking about how we named our communities, like there's things we have today that we didn't have in the past that would make it even more important to make sure that the names weren't conflicting. So again, if you have any questions or comments about anything, it doesn't have to be about this topic. Pop it into the comments. And okay, just checking to make sure. Okay. So when you do look, and this would come up, I did get this question and I forgot, so thanks for whoever out there is reminding me. I get these thoughts in my head. When you do look at your house, your history of your own house, there is some things in addition to the street changing names. So sometimes your street will change names. You have to look out for that. We did have a couple folks on Walnut Street and what is Payne Street today. And you went on there and you'll see right on your search and title or your survey, it'll say formerly Chestnut Street, which is kind of interesting. But just be on the lookout for that. But the other thing that's important too is before, not just names of things, but before 1926 in the village of East Aurora, other communities went through this as well, is June of 1926 is when they standardized the numbering system in the village. Before that, it seemed like, I'm sure they had a system, but it seemed like you could just pick whatever number you wanted for your house, and things were out of order. Well, today, in June of 1926, they finally said, okay, come on, we need to have everybody on a grid. So essentially, East Aurora is on a grid today. So if you're standing on, Main Street and you're at 450 Main Street, well, you look due south and due north, that number 450 is going to go across all the streets to Oakwood, to South Street. They set up this system. Emergency services, but for the post office, and so that way you're going down a street and the numbers just don't change in the middle of what you're doing. And each town has its own system of numbers, and they go in a certain order, and they standardize it. Some counties, Wyoming County for instance, starts in the corner of the county and they have a grid system for the whole county. Erie County doesn't do that. So you'll be driving up Transit Road and you know you've hit a new town when the numbers change. So the numbers are this different on each side of Transit Road because that's where the town line literally goes in the middle of the road. And so that's why there are two different numbers. And that gets really confusing as you think you're on the right track and then all of a sudden you look and the numbers are completely different. And you can tell when you've entered a new town in Erie County, like when you go from Aurora to Wales or Aurora to Colden, because the numbers will switch. So this goes. So what's the point of bringing that up is what is on what you're researching today might not have been what was reality in 1920 or 1910. So remember that things are fluid. Names of streets are fluid, and even the number of your house could be fluid. Let's see here. Oh, I did get a question about. Good question. I did get a question about West Falls, not West Falls, excuse me, Griffin's Mills. And Griffin's Mills, someone had said once that it was speaking of names of communities, that was called West Aurora at one point. Well, the church there was called the West Aurora Congregational Church. And if you ever want to relive history and we talked about this the last time, go there. Contact the church. They're great people, small congregation, but a lot of history and a lot of history that they are excited to talk about. But we have a record of that church being called the West Aurora Congregational Church, and we just assumed that meant Griffin's Mills was once known as West Aurora. But we think that was more, we can't find documentation that Griffin's Mills as a hamlet was ever called West Aurora. We believe that the West Aurora Congregational Church, just used that as a directional. They were on the west side of the town of Aurora, and they probably didn't have West Aurora as their original name before 1818. And they incorporated and chartered after that. We believe it went right from, there was just not enough time in between for it to go from one of its original names, we believe, was Smith's Mills, which was the Smith family, to Griffin's Mills, and West Aurora was never in there. You'll read in history books a lot that West Aurora was the name of Griffin's Mills, that community, but we don't believe it ever was the community's name. And I'm happy to be proven wrong if anybody ever finds anything that says differently. But we never see anything that says, in West Aurora as a location, a locale. And this gets tricky, though, again, because the names were so informal that sometimes someone could call it West Aurora, even though it didn't really technically have that name. Today, we formalize the names just so even of hamlets without their own governments, in order to, for maps and the highway system. In the last 100 years, that's what's happened. But before that, it was a lot more informal. And in New York State, and we talk about this a lot, the history of, and we can talk more about it because we're running out of time today, but the difference between towns, villages, and hamlets and cities. Villages are within towns, and so you can basically, the residents of a town in a certain geographic area within a town, or anywhere actually, it doesn't have to be actually in one town, can incorporate essentially a government homeowners association that they can tax themselves for services. We can talk about this more later, of the history of all that. But when it comes to naming communities, so the village is East Aurora within the town of Aurora, but the village of Aurora is in the town of Ledyard, which is on Cayuga Lake. So technically speaking, you don't have two communities with the same name. You have the village of Aurora in central New York. You have the village of East Aurora here and the town of Aurora here. So they're distinct communities, but that doesn't help when people are showing up at the wrong place, or more often calling the wrong place. I at the historian's office and at town hall we have a little competition to see who gets more of the wrong aurora, and actually keep track just for fun of how many requests I get for the other one. And I've become friends with the village office in the village of Aurora because we refer a lot of calls to them because of the wrong one. But again, changing names is difficult. One of us could probably change our name to something completely not related to Aurora at all. But at this point, we probably can't do that. And it's something to talk about. But I did have a chance to go through the village of Aurora a couple weeks ago, and it was interesting. A very neat community. Don't just go there because it's named Aurora. There's a lot the lake is gorgeous there. Wells College is there. And I remember the one time I had done an article for the Easter Advertiser when I worked there about the two Auroras, and I called the village clerk there, and she said, "Oh yeah," she said, "I heard about you guys. You have that little toy factory there, right?" And I laughed. I said, "Yes, Fisher Price is here." So she was getting calls, just as many calls as we were, of people going to the wrong place. But not just calling the wrong place, people actually showing up at the wrong place, or they made hotel reservations at the wrong one. So, but the reason why, hopefully we've chatted about that a little bit, the reason why that happened was because the town is different than a village, and so we're the town of Aurora and they're the village of Aurora. And if that Aurora didn't exist, most likely we would be the village of Aurora within the town of Aurora. I don't think our folks here would have picked the name Willink. I could be wrong. But I would imagine we would be the village of Aurora. At one point they would have dropped the east or dropped the west, and we would have been the village of Aurora within the town of Aurora. But because of the post office, we can blame them. We were not allowed to do that, so we are now the village of East Aurora. So, well, I think we're out of time for today. Thanks for all who listened and all those who will come on later and watch not live. And again, if you have any questions or comments ever about anything that I talk about here, feel free to drop them in the comments, and I'll try to answer them. Just one last note is Halloween is coming up, and in this week's Advertiser, I learned a lot. I do a monthly column, as most of you know, and this one is on Halloween. And this was one of those columns I accidentally came across as I was looking up something else in the newspapers. And a lot of times you'll hear people talk about kids today and the trouble they get into, and Halloween is one of the example of the mischief that kids today cause on Halloween. Well, East Aurora and other communities like ours, small towns, have a long history of vandalism and pranks that go too far on Halloween. And in fact, that was Halloween in the early days. I learned recently that trick-or-treating is a fairly new concept. After World War II, like 1950s, is when trick-or-treating actually took off and in popularity in the United States. So anything before World War II, that even the term trick-or-treating wasn't used, which I found fascinating because it's become such a part of the holiday. You'd think that it was part of the holiday forever, but it wasn't. And in the early years, 1930s, 1920s, and even into the 1800s, I found articles about the vandalism in East Aurora, and every year there'd be problems, and every year the police chief at the time would put out a statement before Halloween warning kids and parents, not to allow vandalism because they will be arrested. There are consequences for it, and every year it didn't seem to work. There was always vandalism and things like that. But something interesting happened during World War II. And so I'll let you read the column this week, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about it next week, about what happened in World War II in regard to Halloween. Very interesting twist to the calls to end vandalism on Halloween night. So I found it very interesting that, and I was amazed that we haven't trick-or-treated since the beginning of time, that it's a fairly new tradition, 1950s. So there are people still around who, when they were kids, didn't trick-or-treat. Kind of interesting. Again, thanks again for listening in, and we'll see you next time.